I thought my son was giving me a Mother's Day surprise. Instead, I was left standing alone on a beach, my hands trembling, my heart racing. What he demanded from me there changed everything I believed about family. If you're new to my channel, please subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. It truly helps me feel less alone as I share this. My name is Gloria and I am 68 years old. I'm a widow, and for most of my life I believed that loving your children fully meant they would grow up to protect you in return. I believed motherhood was a bond that only deepened with time. I believed it worked both ways. I was wrong, but at the beginning of this story I didn't know that yet. I live in Santa Barbara, California, in a small blue house my late husband and I bought more than 30 years ago. It isn't grand. It doesn't sit high on a cliff or look out over the ocean. But it's solid, quiet, familiar. Every room holds pieces of a life we built together. Birthday mornings at the kitchen table, scraped knees bandaged in the hallway, long talks late at night when the world finally slowed down. After my husband passed, that house became my anchor. It was the one place where I still felt steady, where grief didn't knock me off balance. My son Daniel is my only child. I raised him alone after his father died, working 2 jobs for years and cutting corners everywhere except where he was concerned. I told myself that was what good mothers did. I skipped vacations so he could go to summer camps. I drove an old car so he could have a new one when he graduated college. I never reminded him of what I gave up. Love, I believed, wasn't something you kept score of. It wasn't a transaction, at least that's what I thought. When Daniel married his wife, Lauren, the changes were subtle at first. Easy to dismiss. Conversations became shorter. Visits felt rushed and usually came with quiet requests. Their tone toward me grew sharper, less patient. Lauren often spoke to me as if I were confused even when I wasn't. She'd smile while correcting me in front of others, laugh lightly when I paused to find the right word, gently suggest that I might be forgetting things again. Daniel never stopped her. He stayed quiet, eyes lowered, as if silence were the safest place to stand. So I didn't complain. I told myself families go through phases. I told myself I was being overly sensitive. I told myself that being a mother meant enduring things quietly without making a fuss. So when Daniel called me a week before Mother's Day and said he wanted to take me on a trip, I was genuinely surprised. His voice sounded warm, almost nostalgic. He said I'd been alone too long. He said some fresh air would do me good. He said it was his gift to me. I remember standing in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, smiling at the blank wall like a fool. For the first time in a long while I felt chosen. Lauren picked me up early on Mother's Day morning. Daniel waved from the driver's seat, cheerful and relaxed. They both looked happy, too happy I realize now. We drove for hours. When I asked where we were going, Daniel laughed softly and said it was better if I didn't know. He said surprises were more fun that way. The farther we drove, the quieter I became. Familiar roads disappeared. My phone signal faded. The air grew heavy with salt. When the car finally stopped, we were nowhere near the town they had mentioned. We were on a wide, empty stretch of beach, far from crowds and cafes, far from anything that felt safe or known. Daniel stepped out first. Lauren followed. I climbed out slowly, my knees stiff, the wind tugging at my sweater. I looked around, half expecting to see a picnic table, a small celebration just out of view. Instead, Daniel turned toward me and said very calmly, "Mom, we need to talk." That was when something shifted inside me. Not fear yet, just a deep, sudden cold. The kind that settles in your chest before you understand why. I had no idea that within minutes I would be bargaining for a ride home. I had no idea that the word mother would lose all meaning right there with the ocean crashing behind me. And I had no idea that they truly believed I had no power left at all. After that day on the beach, my mind kept running backward through my life, as if replaying everything might help me understand how I became a woman standing alone, negotiating with her own child for basic dignity. I needed to trace the path that led me there, back to who I was before fear settled into my bones and made everything feel fragile. As I said before, my name is Gloria. I'm 68 years old, and for most of my adult life, I was known simply as Daniel's mom. That role mattered more to me than any title or accomplishment. I married young, built a modest but honest life with my husband, and believed deeply in stability, loyalty, and doing the right thing, especially when no one was watching and no reward was promised. When my husband died suddenly from a heart condition, Daniel was still in high school. One moment I was a wife and the next I was everything. Mother, father, provider, protector. I didn't fall apart even though part of me wanted to. I learned how to fix small things around the house, how to stretch every dollar until it almost hurt, how to keep my voice steady in front of a grieving teenager who needed me to be strong. People told me I was resilient. I never felt resilient. I felt responsible. There's a difference. Daniel and I were close for many years. We ate dinner together most nights, even when money was tight. He told me about his dreams, his disappointments, his fears about the future. When something went wrong, I was the first person he called. I took pride in that. It made every sacrifice feel like it had purpose. That closeness didn't disappear overnight. It faded slowly after he married Lauren. Lauren was polished and confident, always aware of how things looked from the outside. He liked order, clean lines, modern routines, efficiency. I didn't fit easily into that world. I spoke more slowly. I held on to old habits. I asked questions instead of assuming answers. At first, I told myself we were simply different people learning how to coexist. But as time passed, her patience with me wore thin. She sighed when I repeated a story. She interrupted me mid-sentence to clarify what I meant. At family dinners, she corrected me in front of others, always with a smile that made it seem harmless. "Gloria means well," she'd say lightly, "but you know how her memory is." My memory was fine. What hurt more than her words was Daniel's silence. He never stepped in. He never corrected her. He listened, watched, and stayed quiet as if not choosing a side was the safest choice. I told myself he was tired. I told myself he didn't want conflict. I told myself not to take it personally. I had always made a point of not depending on them. I paid my own bills. I kept my house in order. I lived carefully and within my means. I didn't ask for much. But I began to notice that whenever they visited, the conversation drifted toward my home. How large it was, how much upkeep it required, how unsafe it might be for someone my age to live alone. They said these things casually, like friendly advice, like concern. Looking back now, the pattern is obvious. At the time, all I felt was a quiet unease, like the ground beneath me was slowly shifting and I didn't know where it would settle. By the time Mother's Day arrived, I was trying harder than ever to be agreeable, grateful, easy to be around. I didn't want to be a burden. I didn't want to be labeled difficult. I wanted peace more than anything. I never imagined that my desire to keep the peace would be mistaken for weakness. And I never imagined my own son would use that assumption against me. Before everything fell apart, my life was quiet, so quiet it almost felt invisible. Most mornings I woke up before the sun, not because I had to, but because my body still followed the rhythm of years spent working early shifts and carrying responsibility. I'd make myself a simple breakfast, usually toast and tea, and sit by the kitchen window watching the neighborhood slowly come to life. Cars pulling out of driveways. Porch lights switching off. That routine grounded me. It reminded me that I still belonged to the world outside my grief. It kept my house neat, not perfect but cared for. Every object carried a memory. The dining table where Daniel once spread his homework across the surface. The couch where my husband used to fall asleep halfway through old movies. I dusted slowly and deliberately, not because I was weak but because I respected the life I had built there. I lived within my means. I planned every expense. I took quiet pride in not owing anyone anything. Not money, not favors, not explanations. Daniel and Lauren lived differently. Fast. Flashy. New car. New furniture. Weekend trips they posted online with smiling photos and captions about living their best life. Whenever they visited, the conversation always seemed to drift toward money. How expensive things had become, how hard it was to keep up. They never asked me directly for help, but the implication was always there. A pause after a comment. A sideways glance. A casual remark about how lucky I was to own such a valuable asset in my house. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. But their visits grew more frequent, and more uncomfortable. Lauren walked through my home like she was already planning changes. She commented on how outdated the kitchen was, how much better the space would look once it was modernized. She talked about resale value as if it were inevitable, as if my home already belonged to the future she had imagined. Daniel stood nearby, nodding, his hands buried in his pockets, his eyes rarely meeting mine. One afternoon, I overheard Lauren telling Daniel that managing my house would be so much easier if it were officially theirs. Her voice was calm, confident. When I stepped into the room, the conversation stopped instantly. Lauren smiled too quickly and asked if I wanted tea. Daniel looked down at the floor and said nothing. That was the first time I felt truly unsettled. So I stayed quiet. I told myself fear can distort reality. I reminded myself this was my son, my child. I had raised him to be kind. I had held him through nightmares and heartbreaks. I had trusted him with my heart for decades. Surely I was misunderstanding things. So when he called about the Mother's Day trip, I ignored the small voice inside me that hesitated. I told myself this was his way of reconnecting. His way of saying thank you. I wanted to believe that. The drive that morning felt long but not alarming at first. We talked about small, ordinary things, weather, traffic, nothing that mattered. Lauren scrolled on her phone, barely looking up. When I asked where we were going, Daniel smiled and said, "Just relax, Mom." As the city faded behind us, my unease crept back in. My phone lost signal. The roads narrowed. I asked again where we were headed. This time, Daniel didn't answer right away. Lauren glanced at him briefly, then returned her attention to her screen. When the car finally stopped and I stepped onto the sand, I was confused, not afraid. I thought maybe lunch was planned nearby. A walk. A quiet celebration away from the crowds. Then Daniel turned toward me, his face serious in a way I hadn't seen in years. And that was when he said it. He told me that if I wanted to go home, I needed to sign my house over to him. He said it calmly, evenly, like it was reasonable. Like he was doing me a favor by offering a ride back at all. Lauren stood beside him, arms crossed, watching me closely, not with concern but with expectation. The ocean roared behind us, loud and relentless. My feet sank into the sand as my heart pounded in my ears. In that moment, something became painfully clear. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't concern. This was a plan. And I was standing right in the middle of it. I didn't cry right away, and that surprised me. I stood there on the sand with the wind pressing against my back, the sting of salt in my eyes, and all I felt at first was a heavy numbness. It was as if my body hadn't caught up with what my heart had just heard. My own son. My home. A condition placed on whether I would be taken back. My thoughts kept circling those words, trying to rearrange them into something that made sense. Something that didn't hurt so much. I asked Daniel if he was serious. My voice sounded smaller than I expected, thin and fragile, almost swallowed by the roar of the waves behind us. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't show anger. Somehow that made it worse. He nodded once, calmly, and said this was the only way forward. He said the house would be safer in his name. He said I wouldn't have to worry anymore. He told me to think of it as family helping family. Lauren didn't say much. She didn't need to. Her silence was sharp and deliberate. She watched my face closely, her eyes fixed on me, waiting for fear to do the work she didn't have to speak aloud. I felt a rush of heat surge through my chest, then drain away just as quickly, leaving me unsteady. My hands began to tremble and I folded them together tightly to hide it. I looked around and finally understood how isolated I was. There were no nearby houses. No shops. No familiar faces. Just open beach and endless water stretching in every direction. I checked my phone. No signal. For the first time in my life I felt truly stranded, not just physically but emotionally. I thought of every night I had stayed awake worrying about Daniel. Every dollar I had saved instead of spending on myself. Every moment I had chosen patience over confrontation because I was afraid of losing him. And there I was, being asked to trade my safety, my home, my last sense of stability, for a car ride. I wanted to scream. I wanted to demand how he could do this to me. I wanted to remind him of who I was to him, of everything I had been. But none of those words came out. All I could think was that if I showed panic, if I broke down, it would give them exactly what they wanted. The humiliation cut deeper than the fear. I felt old in a way I never had before. Not because of my body but because of how easily they dismissed my humanity. In that moment I wasn't a mother to them. I wasn't even a person. I was an obstacle standing between them and something they wanted. Daniel told me to take my time and think it over, as if this were a business negotiation. He said they would wait nearby. Then he turned away and he and Lauren walked back toward the car, leaving me standing alone on the sand. I lowered myself down slowly, my knees aching, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I stared out at the ocean and focused on my breathing, trying to steady myself. Part of me wanted to believe this was a cruel misunderstanding that could still be fixed if I said the right words. Another part of me, quieter but stronger, knew something had broken. And it wasn't going to fix itself. For the first time since my husband died, I felt truly unsafe. Not because of strangers. Not because of the world. But because of my own child. As terrifying as that realization was, it forced me to face a question I had avoided for years. If I didn't protect myself now, who would? I don't know how long I sat there on the sand after they walked away. Time felt distorted, stretched thin by fear and disbelief. The wind grew colder as the sun began to shift, and with every passing minute, the weight of my situation pressed deeper into my chest. I was 68 years old, miles from home, without transportation, without a phone signal, without anyone who seemed to care whether I was safe or not. My thoughts spiraled in circles I couldn't escape. I kept asking myself how it had come to this, how a day meant to honor motherhood had turned into a quiet threat. I replayed Daniel's childhood in my mind, his small hand wrapped around mine, the sound of his footsteps running down the hallway after a nightmare, his voice calling out for me in the dark. I kept wondering when that child disappeared, and how he became someone capable of leaving his own mother alone on a beach. The humiliation cut almost deeper than the fear. I felt exposed, reduced to something small and disposable. I imagined how easily something could happen to me there. A fall, a sudden medical issue, an accident with no one around to notice. I wasn't fragile, but I knew my limits. And they knew them too. The realization that they had chosen this place, this moment, because of my age and isolation tore at me in a way I wasn't prepared for. I called out to them once, my voice carried away and swallowed by the wind. There was no answer. Their car was parked far enough away that I couldn't see inside. They were waiting. Waiting for fear to do what they didn't have to say out loud. They were confident time would wear me down. For a brief, terrifying moment I considered giving in. That thought frightened me more than anything else. I pictured myself signing papers I didn't fully understand just to be taken home. I imagined losing the one place where I still felt safe, still felt like myself. And in that moment I understood something clearly. If I surrendered now, it wouldn't end here. This would only be the beginning. A wave of grief washed over me then. Not just grief for myself, but for the relationship I thought I had with my son. I mourned the idea of family I had carried with me for decades. The belief that blood meant loyalty. That sacrifice was seen. That love was remembered. As the sun dipped lower, I forced myself to stand. My legs were unsteady, but my thoughts were starting to settle. Fear was still there, sharp and heavy, but something else was growing beside it. A quiet resolve. I reminded myself that panic would only serve them. That I needed to think, not react. I walked slowly along the shoreline, keeping my distance from the water, focusing on my breathing. In and out. One step at a time. I reminded myself that I had survived worse. I had buried my husband. I had raised a child alone. I had rebuilt my life from grief once already. This moment, as cruel and humiliating as it was, would not be the end of me. What hurt the most was Daniel's silence. He didn't check on me. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't hesitate. That silence told me everything I needed to know. By the time he finally came back, the sun was nearly gone. He asked me if I was ready to be reasonable. His voice was calm, almost practiced, as if he had rehearsed the line. I looked at him then and understood something important. They thought I was trapped. They thought I was afraid enough to give up anything. They thought I had no strength left. They were wrong. When Daniel came back, I didn't answer him right away. I studied his face. The same face I once watched carefully for signs of fever when he was a child. And a deep, aching confusion settled into my chest. How could someone raised with so much care speak to his own mother like this? How could love be turned into leverage so easily? Lauren stood a few steps behind him, her arms crossed tightly, her weight shifted onto one hip. She looked irritated, not concerned, as if my hesitation were an inconvenience rather than a warning sign. I noticed how calm they both were. That calm told me this wasn't impulsive. This wasn't said in the heat of the moment. It had been discussed, planned, agreed upon long before that morning. Daniel asked again if I was ready to do the sensible thing. He spoke slowly, carefully, the way people do when they believe the person in front of them is fragile or confused. Something twisted inside me then. It wasn't anger yet, it was heavier than that. It was the realization that he no longer saw me as his mother. I wasn't someone to protect or listen to. I was a problem to be solved. I told him I needed time. Just a little time. I said my head was spinning and I couldn't make a decision like this under pressure. My voice shook despite my effort to keep it steady. I hated that part, the visible crack I couldn't hide. Lauren rolled her eyes and turned away toward the ocean. They spoke quietly between themselves, not even bothering to lower their voices. I caught pieces of their conversation as the wind carried it toward me. She'll come around. She doesn't have a choice. It's better this way. Those words hit harder than anything else that day. I felt completely isolated, not just from them but from the world itself. The beach felt vast and empty, stretching endlessly in every direction. The sound of the waves no longer calmed me. It pressed against my ears like a reminder of how small and powerless they believed I was. I had never felt so disposable in my life. Inside my chest, two forces were battling each other. One was fear, raw and urgent. Fear of being abandoned. Fear of losing my home. Fear of growing old without safety or shelter. The other was quieter, steadier. A voice reminding me that I had survived decades of hardship without surrendering my dignity. I thought about what giving in would mean. It wouldn't just be losing my house. It would be confirming everything they believed about me, that I was weak, that my age made me easy to corner, that love could be used as a weapon. That thought hardened something inside me. I told Daniel I would think about it overnight. I asked if they could at least take me to a motel nearby so I could rest and clear my head. I said I wanted to make the right decision, for all of us. I watched him carefully as he hesitated. Lauren frowned, clearly annoyed, but Daniel eventually agreed. One night he said, "No more." As we drove away from the beach, silence filled the car. I stared out the window, my reflection faintly visible in the glass. My face looked tired, but it didn't look broken. Inside my heart still ached. I felt betrayed, humiliated, and painfully alone. But beneath all of that, something important was taking shape. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't just reacting. I was thinking. And that was the beginning of everything changing. That night, alone in the small motel room, I barely slept. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and old carpet, and the low hum of the air conditioner filled the silence like a nervous breath. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, my hands resting in my lap, staring at them as if they belonged to someone else. Every word Daniel had spoken on that beach replayed in my mind. The calm in his voice haunted me more than anger ever could. As the hours passed, something else began to surface. Memories I had tucked away and avoided for years. After my husband died, there was a long stretch when I didn't trust anyone, not even myself. I was terrified of making the wrong decision, of doing something that might cost Daniel his future. That fear was what led me, quietly and carefully, to seek advice back then. I remembered sitting in a small office with a lawyer my husband trusted, the blinds half drawn, papers spread neatly across the desk. I hadn't fully understood everything at the time, but I signed because I knew I needed protection. That memory returned with sudden clarity. My husband had insisted on safeguards. He said life had taught him one hard truth: people change, even family. He made sure the house was placed into a trust designed to protect me for the rest of my life. No transfer without my consent. No pressure. No loopholes. Back then it felt unnecessary. Almost pessimistic. I had even questioned whether it was too much. Now it felt like a lifeline. Daniel didn't know about the trust. Lauren certainly didn't. They assumed the house was mine in a way that made it easy to take. They assumed my age had dulled my understanding. They assumed I hadn't prepared for exactly this kind of moment. I leaned back on the bed and let that truth sink into my bones. The fear didn't disappear, but it shifted. It loosened its grip. For the first time since arriving at that beach, I felt grounded, steady in a way I hadn't felt in days. I picked up my phone and walked slowly toward the window, holding it up, searching for a signal. It flickered once. Then again. Just enough. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't confront anyone. Instead, I called the lawyer whose name I still remembered. It was late, so I left a message, short, calm, deliberate. I told him I needed help, that it was urgent, that it involved my son and my home. After that, I sat quietly and waited. I didn't cry that night. I didn't panic. I let the silence settle around me and do its work. I thought about what I wanted, not revenge fueled by anger but justice rooted in self-respect. I thought about boundaries I should have set long ago. I thought about how love should never require surrendering your safety. By morning, my plan wasn't fully formed, but my resolve was. When Daniel picked me up the next day, he carried himself with confidence. He asked if I had come to my senses. I looked at him calmly and told him I was ready to talk at home. I said I wanted everything handled properly with paperwork like adults. He smiled, relieved. Lauren smiled too. They thought they had won. What they didn't know was that I was no longer alone in this. And I was no longer afraid. The drive back was quiet, but it felt nothing like the drive out. Daniel seemed relaxed now, almost cheerful, as if the hardest part was already behind him. Lauren talked about errands she needed to run once we got back, about how busy the coming week would be. They spoke around me, not to me, already behaving as if the decision had been made without my consent. I watched the road slide past the window and said very little. Inside, I was steadying myself. Every mile carried me closer to familiar streets, closer to my home. The place where this situation would stop being a private threat whispered in isolation and become something clear, documented, and undeniable. When we arrived, Daniel followed me inside without waiting to be invited. Lauren walked through my house as if it already belonged to her, glancing around with a satisfied look that tightened my stomach. They sat at my dining table, the same table where Daniel once spilled juice while struggling through homework, and Daniel said we should handle this quickly. That was the moment my decision became firm, even if I didn't announce it out loud. I told them I agreed that everything needed to be handled properly. I said I wanted all paperwork reviewed by a lawyer before anything was signed. I watched their expressions shift just slightly. Lauren frowned and said that wasn't necessary. Daniel added that we could save time and money by keeping it simple. I shook my head and said no. My voice didn't tremble. I told them this was my home and my life, and I wouldn't sign anything without legal advice. I reminded Daniel that rushing me wouldn't change my answer. The room fell quiet. Lauren's irritation rose to the surface, no longer disguised. Daniel's patience thinned, and for the first time, I saw uncertainty flicker across his face. That flicker gave me strength. I told them I had already contacted a lawyer. I didn't explain how or when. I simply said I wanted a family meeting with everything laid out clearly and properly. I said we could all be there together. Transparency, I called it. Lauren stood up abruptly, accusing me of making things difficult. She said I was being dramatic, that this didn't need to be such a big deal. Daniel tried to calm her, but I could see the tension spreading between them. The control they believed they had was slipping away. That night, after they left, I sat alone in my living room and felt something close to peace for the first time since Mother's Day. I knew what was coming next would be uncomfortable, painful even. But I also knew I wasn't walking into it blind or afraid. I had stopped reacting to their pressure. I had stopped trying to keep them comfortable. For the first time I was choosing myself. And that choice changed everything. The family meeting took place 3 days later in a quiet conference room at my lawyer's office. I arrived early, my hands folded neatly in my lap, breathing slowly and deliberately. The room smelled faintly of coffee and paper, clean and impersonal. It felt like neutral ground, and that mattered. For once, I wasn't trapped in a car or isolated on a beach. I was seated at a table where everyone would be heard, and where the truth couldn't be rushed or interrupted. Daniel and Lauren arrived together. They looked confident, carefully dressed, as if appearance alone might tilt the balance in their favor. Lauren smiled politely at the lawyer, then glanced at me with an expression that told me she still believed this was nothing more than a formality. Daniel avoided my eyes, his focus fixed somewhere just past me. When the lawyer entered, he greeted me by name and asked if I was ready to begin. I nodded. My heart was beating faster than I wanted it to, but my hands remained steady. I explained what had happened on Mother's Day, calmly and clearly. I described the drive, the beach, the demand. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply told the truth from beginning to end. As I spoke, I watched Daniel's posture change. His shoulders stiffened. He shifted in his chair. Lauren's polite smile slowly disappeared. When I finished, the lawyer turned to them and asked if they disagreed with my account. There was a long pause. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. Lauren spoke instead, saying they had only been trying to help me make a responsible decision. The lawyer nodded once without comment and opened a folder in front of him. He explained the trust. He explained that my home was protected by legal safeguards put in place years earlier. That no transfer could occur without my informed, voluntary consent. That any attempt to pressure or coerce me could be considered elder abuse under state law. The room fell completely still. Daniel stared down at the table. Lauren's face flushed, her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. She tried to argue that they hadn't meant any harm, that I was exaggerating the situation. The lawyer didn't debate her. He calmly outlined the consequences of their actions, clearly, professionally, without emotion. For the first time I saw fear in their eyes. I spoke again then. My voice was steady. I told them I was hurt but I was finished being manipulated. I said I would not be signing anything. I said any further discussion about my property would go through my lawyer. I said I expected distance and respect, and that if I didn't receive it there would be consequences. Daniel finally looked at me. Not with anger but with disbelief, as if he couldn't understand how the woman he thought was powerless had taken control of the room. I stood up slowly, thanked the lawyer and walked out without waiting for a response. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt relieved. Because in that room, in front of witnesses and facts, the truth had been spoken, and it could not be taken back. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They unfolded quietly and steadily the way real accountability often does. There were no shouting matches, no dramatic phone calls begging for forgiveness. Instead there was silence, and within that silence a clear and undeniable shift in power. Within days, a formal letter was sent from my lawyer to Daniel and Lauren. It laid out boundaries in plain, unmistakable language. No further discussions about my property. No unannounced visits. Any communication involving finances or housing would go through legal counsel only. The letter wasn't cruel and it wasn't threatening. It was firm. And it represented something I had never allowed myself to be before. Daniel tried calling me once after that. I watched the phone ring from across the room and didn't answer. My chest tightened as it went to voicemail, but I didn't feel guilty. Guilt had kept me trapped for far too long. This time I chose safety over sentiment, clarity over habit. Within the family the truth spread quickly. Daniel's aunt called first, her voice unsteady as she apologized for not noticing what had been happening. A cousin reached out next, then an old family friend. I didn't share details. I didn't need to. The moment lawyers became involved, the story Daniel and Lauren had been telling, about concern, about helping me, began to unravel on its own. Daniel's confidence collapsed with it. I learned later that many of their financial plans had depended on my house. Loans they expected to secure didn't go through. Commitments they had made to others had to be quietly withdrawn. Lauren stopped attending family gatherings altogether. Daniel showed up once, awkward and subdued, keeping to the edges of the room and avoiding conversation. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one bending to keep the peace. I noticed changes in myself too. I slept through the night. I ate regularly again. The tight knot I had carried in my chest for months began to loosen. I moved through my house without feeling watched or evaluated. Each room felt like mine again. Not a future asset, not a bargaining chip, not something waiting to be taken. The power dynamic had shifted completely. They no longer spoke to me with assumptions. They didn't push. They didn't joke about my age or my memory. Distance had taught them something that politeness never did. And for the first time since Mother's Day, I felt something deeper than relief. I felt safe. Victory didn't arrive with applause or celebration. It came quietly in small moments that slowly stitched my life back together. One morning I woke up and realized I hadn't checked my phone with a sense of dread. I brewed my coffee and noticed my hands weren't shaking. I stood in my living room and felt, deeply and undeniably, that I was safe in my own space again. I secured everything that mattered. With my lawyer's help, I reviewed my finances, updated documents, and reinforced the protections around my home. Nothing extravagant, just clarity, structure, and certainty. For years, I had avoided these steps because I didn't want to seem distrustful. I worried it would look like bitterness. Now I understood something I hadn't before. Preparation isn't cruelty. It's self-respect. I changed my routines as well. I joined a small walking group in my neighborhood, something I had always told myself I didn't have time for. I began volunteering at the local library twice a week, shelving books and greeting familiar faces. I allowed myself to build a life that wasn't centered around waiting. Waiting for calls that might never come, waiting for approval that might never be given. Independence felt unfamiliar at first, like a muscle I hadn't used in a long time. But with each passing week it felt more natural. Daniel stayed distant. He didn't apologize, at least not directly. The silence between us remained, but it had changed. It no longer felt like punishment or rejection. It felt like consequence. I stopped hoping he would suddenly become the son I remembered. I accepted the man he had chosen to be without trying to fix him or explain him away. Lauren never reached out. That absence spoke clearly enough. What surprised me most was how strong I felt without confrontation. I didn't need them to admit they were wrong for me to know the truth. I didn't need validation from the very people who had tried to take advantage of me. I had reclaimed something far more important than approval. I had reclaimed my dignity. My home remained mine. My life remained mine. And for the first time in years, my future felt like something I could shape on my own terms. Not through sacrifice, not through fear, but through choice. Now, when I look back on that day at the beach, I no longer feel the sharp fear that once lived in my chest. I remember it clearly, the wind cutting across my skin, the grit of sand under my shoes, the way my son spoke to me as if I were something to be managed instead of someone to be loved. The memory hasn't disappeared, but it no longer defines me. It reminds me. I learned that growing older does not mean growing powerless. It means seeing more clearly. It means understanding that love without respect is not love at all. For years, I confused patience with endurance and silence with grace. I believed that if I stayed quiet, if I stayed giving, things would eventually work themselves out. They didn't. What changed my life wasn't anger or revenge. It was self-respect. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't beg. I didn't fight them the way they expected me to. I simply stood still long enough to remember who I was before fear tried to shrink me. I was a woman who built a life from loss. A woman who carried responsibility without complaint. A woman who deserved safety in her own home. I also learned that boundaries don't destroy families. Betrayal does. When I finally set mine, I wasn't choosing cruelty. I was choosing survival with my dignity intact. If that choice cost me a relationship that was already rooted in manipulation, then it was a cost I was willing to bear. To anyone listening who feels invisible because of age, because of family pressure, because of years spent putting others first, please hear this. Silence is not surrender. Patience is not weakness. And it is never too late to protect yourself. I am 68 years old. I was abandoned once, but I was never powerless. And I walked away from that beach stronger than they ever imagined. If this story touched something inside you, please don't stay silent. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this. And share it with someone who might need strength today. And before you go, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from right now? Your words remind me that none of us are truly alone.